So we are pleased to have Aaron Schaefer with us today. Aaron is the Vice President and Information Security Officer for NBC Universal's Direct-to-Consumer Business Unit that includes Fandango, Voodoo, and Peacock. He has over 20 years of experience in software engineering, network and application security. He has spent the last 12 years in various cybersecurity roles, where he has led projects in industry, including media, defense, energy, and financial services. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Let me just share my slides here. And hopefully you'll be able to see this when I go in presenter mode. Okay, so today we're going to talk about software as a service. And I called this a practitioner's guide because I really want to talk about how us as security professionals need to protect these environments. When you look at big institutions, Fortune 500 companies, universities, and government institutions, they're using so much SaaS, so much software as a service now that it's becoming our responsibility to ensure that we're protecting the users, the data, and how we integrate with those systems. So that's what we're going to focus on today. But before we jump into SaaS, I want to do a quick refresher on the public cloud. When we talk about the public cloud, we usually talk about really three categories: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then of course our topic, software as a service. And infrastructure as a service is really where we have basically virtual machines, virtual infrastructure. We can spin up hard drives, we can spin up actual servers. We have complete control over everything that's spun up there. We have complete control over all the compute that's in that environment. Of course, folks know the big three in that space: Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. There's others, but those are the three big ones. Moving on the platform as a service, this is where we start to abstract away a lot of that infrastructure. With infrastructure as a service, I have to worry about the operating system. I have to worry about patching it. I have to worry about how much hard drive and space I have and things like that. With platform as a service, the provider worries about that. And all they're really doing is they're giving me an environment where I can deploy code, right? So if I have a runtime, maybe it's .NET or maybe it's Java, they give me all the libraries, they give me all the framework that I need to be able to deploy my application and run it in that environment. I don't actually have to worry about the actual operating system there. And so some examples of that are things like Heroku, Elastic Beanstalk in AWS, and Google's App Engine. And then, of course, our topic is moving to software as a service, where none of that is my concern anymore. I don't have to worry about writing any code. I don't have to worry about patching my code or vulnerabilities to my code. All the code is provided by the vendor. So they run the application, and now I have to have my users log in and use it and transfer data to that environment. So really, those are the three main categories we talk about when we talk about public cloud. And so when we talk about software as a service, we really want to think about the different types of categories there, because I think folks probably think about G Suite and Office 365 and think, yeah, those are typical SaaS applications, but there's so many more. And the logos there in the middle that I have on the slide, that's just a very, very small slice, just to give you a sense of the different types of SaaS applications that are out there. So we talked about productivity, obviously, with G Suite and Office 365, but there's customer resource management, things like Zendesk. There's collaboration suites. I'm sure folks have used Slack, or even something like now Discord, right? That's considered software as a service too. We can manage documents in the cloud. We can do CMS, content management, project management. We can visualize our data, so we can do tons of analytics and graphics work on data. We can also deploy code and store our code in the cloud. And what I find is interesting is that we're also able to even do really resource intensive things that you traditionally would have thought that you could only do on a high-end workstation. Things like rendering and editing video. You could basically take the entire workflow of a TV production or a film production, and you could do almost all of it in the cloud today. There are various applications that allow you to do that. So think about even editing the video, or you get to a point where you want to share it. So for instance, in Hollywood, folks share a pre-release movie or TV show. They call it a screener. In the old days, they used to send DVDs out, physical copies. They don't do that anymore. Now it's all online. And we're not talking just YouTube, right? We're talking actual secure platforms where they can share these for just folks to see it before it gets released. So the point I'm trying to make here is really that our businesses, all the Fortune 500 companies, governments, universities, we are becoming so reliant on software as a service. Our users are putting critical data in this environment, and our business just really has to run on it. So it's becoming a concern, or it's been a concern for security professionals to ensure that we protect that area. So when we think about that, when we think about protecting it, we probably say, well, with all of that stuff abstracted away from us, there's probably not a lot that we need to do, right? It should be all on the vendors. And that's not true. Obviously, we wouldn't be having this talk if that were true. But when we think about that, we think about something that's called the shared responsibility model. So this is pretty typical when talking about cloud environments. Folks talk about the shared responsibility model. So if you were to look this up, you'll see various implementations of this, basically different ways that people talk about the shared responsibility model. And when talking about infrastructure as a service, like we said, we spin up everything, right? So it's pretty much all on us. We have to worry about patching the operating systems. We have to worry about the network communication. So all that responsibility is on us. Moving on the platform as a service, again, a lot of that's abstracted from us. We just worry about our code that we're deploying in that environment, and then the data that's there and the users. But software as a service is where it gets a little muddy. And you'll see various versions of this where some folks combine user access and data. Other folks say that, well, the data is really the responsibility of the SaaS vendor. I don't think that's really true. I think that we absolutely play a part in protecting the data, because of course the vendors are going to protect their systems and ensure that folks can't get to their part of it. But as you'll see through these slides, there's a lot of ways that we can enable data to be accessed by, undesirable people, undesirable locations. So we're going to talk a lot about that. I also think that there's something that's actually missing from the shared responsibility model. We talk a lot about user access, and that's important. We talk a lot about data access, but what we don't talk about is configuration. And these SaaS platforms, I talked about the video production ones, but even the productivity ones like G Suite and Office 365, they're getting so complex now. There's so many features that are available, and some of those features can actually reduce our security posture based on the way that they're configured. There are even things like APIs that are available now. So we can programmatically access data, programmatically add users or remove users from the platform. We can integrate SaaS, between different vendors, right? So something like maybe Salesforce can talk to Slack, or someone can post something in Slack and have it automatically generate a file or a ticket in Salesforce or ServiceNow. And a lot of these platforms now are getting so big that they're even building their own app stores. So you can go into something like Office 365, and Microsoft has an app store where you can integrate a plugin. You can get a plugin or an add-on from another vendor, not Microsoft, who's written something that can make your team more productive, but also can increase the risk. And we'll talk about why that is. And then there's things that we can configure, like anonymous data access. So I can turn on anonymous access in some of these systems so that anyone with the link can get to my data, even though my data is very sensitive. And so maybe a user who's not as knowledgeable about security might inadvertently turn that on, and then we've got a problem with data leakage. So that's my case for adding configuration to the shared responsibility model. And we're basically going to touch on all of these. So when we talk about this now, when we talk about user access, when we talk about data and configuration, what is our role as security professionals in those three areas? Because we're not the only ones that have to deal with the platform. In fact, we're not going to be the ones that are actually going to configure the platform, most likely. In a large enterprise, Usually there's maybe like a workplace technology team or a collaboration team or an enterprise application team that actually maintains the SaaS environment. They're the ones that set up the configuration. They work with maybe a finance or procurement department to go and procure licenses. They roll the users onto it. They onboard them, do training, that sort of stuff. So where we fall in is really thinking about the threats to the environment. And so what I've laid out here is some of those steps that we really need to focus on as security practitioners. With the first one, I think, being modeling the threats, right? And so we're going to walk through threat modeling here, specific to SaaS environments. Once we've modeled that threats, we need to analyze what we can do about that so that we can generate a list of mitigations to reduce the risk to the environment, right? So model, analyze, and mitigate are really critical. And that's what we're going to talk about in the bulk of this presentation. But as I mentioned, we're not the ones deploying this, right? So, in large organizations, we're going to come up with those lists of mitigations, but we're still going to have to partner with our peers in IT who are actually going to be the ones that are going to configure the environment and implement those mitigations for us. We also need to work closely with the users. So, in my example of Office 365, some users may say, oh, we're just uploading spreadsheets and that's kind of it. And it's no big deal. And we may find out that actually other users are actually uploading very sensitive, maybe personally identifiable information, maybe credit card data or social security numbers. And now we know that there's more sensitive data in that environment. Sometimes we even see users who will go out and get a free version of a SaaS platform, like something like Slack, right, where there's a free tier. And when we find out about it and it comes under our security view and we start implementing those controls, suddenly those features that they were using are either disabled or the user experience changes. And now you have a bunch of upset users. So an example of that would be, maybe somebody gets the free tier of Slack and then we realize we want to deploy it across the whole company. And now they're using like the enterprise grid version of Slack and we've enabled multi-factor authentication. So where they were logging in every day with just a username and password, suddenly they're being prompted to set up multi-factor and have a PIN on their phone, and that kind of throws them off. So we'll talk a bit about that and how we need to be mindful of that. The last two parts here, we won't touch on as much. We'll touch on it just a little bit because it's very important that we do monitor any system, any environment, right, as security professionals, and that we're able to respond to incidents. I think the incident response playbook and how we monitor systems changes just a little bit for SaaS. So we'll touch on that, but overall, it's pretty much the same for any system, really. So we won't delve into that too much. So let's dive into the first part, modeling the threat. So hopefully folks are familiar with threat modeling. We could absolutely spend a whole other lecture, a whole other session talking just about threat modeling. So I'm going to start with a refresher, and then we're actually going to do a threat model. So if you haven't done a threat model before, hopefully you'll pick it up along the way. So what I'm showing here is just a very high level example of a visualization of a threat model. So here, what we've done is we've laid out the actors, we've laid out the data flows, the system components. You can see the trust boundaries there. And what's important to note is that we're showing the data flow, right? We're showing the ports and protocols that are being used. We're showing the type of data that might be flowing between those systems. That's going to be important context that we're going to need. But the threat model really should be looking at the system holistically, right? We want to identify the gaps that are going to reduce our security posture. It's going to take in multiple perspectives. We're going to take in these data flows, the architecture diagrams. We're going to talk to our business stakeholders to find out how they plan to use the SaaS service. We're going to decompose it here like we did graphically. And then finally, we're going to come out with that output, that list of risks and mitigations, which is really the whole point, right? To come out with how we can reduce risk. What are the actual things that we can implement, the practical, actionable things? As part of threat modeling, I highly recommend using a framework. It's probably one of the only things I'll plug in this talk, and that's the Mitre attack framework. If you're not familiar with Mitre, I'm not going to dive into it too much, but I am using it in my threat model. So I think you'll get a sense for how useful it is. But the Mitre attack framework is just fantastic for this sort of thing. So, okay, to do an actual threat model here, we need an example. So I didn't want to take an actual vendor's product and model that. I don't want Microsoft or Google to hound me and say I was pointing out some things that aren't true about their platform. So I made up a fictional productivity suite that will model. But all of these capabilities are real world, and all of these business use cases are real world. Like we see these things all the time, right? So in my fictional productivity suite, it has a word processor, it has spreadsheets, it has a chat application, and it has document storage. Okay, easy enough. We find out from talking to our business stakeholders that they're going to store very sensitive company documents in there. Maybe it's contracts, legal documents, maybe it's HR data, whatever it is, we know it's very sensitive data, so we need to worry about it. We also find out it's not going to be just employees using the SaaS service. And we see this a lot too, right? Third parties, contractors, consultants, they may need access to the data. So they're going to need accounts into the SaaS environment too. Using my earlier example of an app store, this productivity suite also has an app store where users can go in and add plugins. And we find out that that's on by default. That's something that's just there that users can do. We also find out that it has an API, so we can programmatically access. We find out that one of our business units actually wants to integrate this SaaS environment back to our on-prem corporate network where we have an HR system. And so as you can imagine, HR systems on the corporate network, highly protected. They're going to have very sensitive data. Maybe it's payroll data, it's information, my personal information, my social security number, that sort of thing. And they want to integrate with that back to from the cloud back to on-prem. And then finally, we know that another business unit wants to take a different SaaS product and integrate it with our productivity suite. And so my example there, if you're familiar with the term CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, I mentioned earlier that DevOps teams can deploy code in the cloud, right, and maintain code in the cloud. So, maybe there's a system running in the cloud that can produce build notifications, build failed or a unit test failed. And so this business unit is saying, we want those notifications to go to the chat application as part of the SaaS productivity suite. So another integration there that we need to worry about. So great. We know what the SaaS service is capable of. We know what our business users want to do with it. And now basically it's time to start putting our visual threat model together. And that takes time, right? There's a lot of work and a lot of thought to go in there. I'm going to jump ahead in the interest of time and just show the threat model that I put together for this. So here, hopefully you're seeing those use cases that we laid out, right? We have our corporate user connecting to the SaaS platform. Another SaaS platform can talk to that. We've got our third-party users coming in, and then we've got that connectivity back to the HR system. But since we looked at data flows, we looked at architecture diagrams, we've learned a lot. We learned that the corporate users are able to connect to the SaaS platform using our enterprise IDP, our enterprise identity platform. And that's something that, as cybersecurity team, we probably maintain and have control over. So that's good. The other thing is that we can enable multi-factor authentication there, all good stuff. But we quickly find out that the third parties, they're not using our enterprise system. The SaaS provider just allows them to come in with just a username and password, single factor. So already we're seeing an issue there. We also find out that the APIs that the SaaS provider has opened up for anyone to programmatically access the system can allow basic authentication. That's a legacy protocol, insecure. We don't want to see that. So that's also not good news. And then finally, in my made up example here, we find that the connectivity back to that on-prem HR system, it's not end-to-end TLS, right? So it's not encrypted all the way through from one system to the other because there's a firewall in the middle. So sometimes you'll see things like that where the TLS encryption can be terminated at the firewall. And yes, you're inside the corporate network at that point, but the traffic is still encrypted. So we'll talk about why that's bad. So immediately, right, just from doing the visual threat model, we've already found some issues that we're going to have to address. Great. So we've got our use cases, we've got our visual threat model. What's next? Next is going to our framework. So we're going to jump into the Mitre attack framework. And if you're not familiar with it, the Mitre attack framework is an open source knowledge base of huge knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques. These are based on real world observations, right? So we know that adversaries are using these tactics and techniques to try and compromise our environments, right? Whether it's governments, Fortune 500 companies, really anywhere, we see these tactics and techniques. What I've taken here is one of the matrices that Mitre has created for a different category. So they have a huge library, but they have these matrices for specific categories. So they have one for SaaS, for software as a service. So that's what you're seeing here. So they've already done a lot of great work for us. And what you can also see is the steps, the attack chain, if you're unfamiliar with that, is basically the steps that an adversary has to take to act on their objectives, right? So whether their objective is to get ransomware on a system and encrypt all of our data, right, and hold it for ransom, or just exfiltrate data and steal data. These are the steps that they have to take. Now, in my example, the threat model that we're doing here, the SaaS environment that I've created, it's a little bit broader than just SaaS, since it has another SaaS platform, it has third parties, and we're connecting back to on-prem. So in my actual threat model that I'll show you next, I actually went through the broader Mitre attack framework. So we used pretty much all the tactics and techniques. We looked through all of those, but I wanted to take the one for SaaS to show it here. So anyway, this is a great framework, like I said. So the next step now, taking that framework, going through those tactics and seeing which ones, analyzing which ones really apply to our environment, really apply to that SaaS vendor. So this is another thing that takes a long time, right? So a security architect will spend maybe days, maybe weeks going through this, depending on how big the platform is. So I've saved us all some time and already laid that out here. And I'm going to walk through these and talk about, why we found these and why these are bad, specific to the SaaS environment, right? So what I've laid out here is the individual threat, and we came up with almost a dozen, the actual tactic and technique from the Mitre attack framework, and then the likelihood and impact. Hopefully, as everybody is aware, to determine risk, it's a factor of the likelihood against the impact, right? So if something is low likelihood and low impact, it's going to be low risk, right? So I tried to lay that out here, take some guesses on that based on what we're seeing. So the first threat here really goes back to that end-to-end TLS, right? We have the risk of data intercept there, what we would call man in the middle, or maybe now we'd say person in the middle or machine in the middle, where basically data can be intercepted. Someone can do packet sniffing and see what data is being transferred. And since it's unencrypted, it's potential that you could be that machine in the middle and actually modify the data. So that's a concern. The next two are around account takeover and account compromise, because thinking back to those third-party accounts that have access to our SaaS environment, they don't have multi-factor authentication. And since they're not using our IDP, we also don't have controls like an anti-fraud mechanism, something that can detect bots, something that can detect brute force and like credential stuffing. So that's a big threat. We had mentioned the legacy authentication, right? So we see legacy authentication as something that's easily breakable today, easy to be compromised. It can also be used to bypass multi-factor authentication a lot of times. We also found out as we were exploring the documentation from the vendor and the way that it works, that in order to access the API, you granted a service account. And unfortunately, the service account is over permissioned and has access to more of the data than you would want it to actually have access to. Like maybe if you only wanted to have access to your marketing department's data, it actually can have access to HR and finance and other departments too. Again, these are real world things that we see in SaaS environments. I talked earlier about anonymous links. So we find that that's something that the users can control and set up. So We know that that's a threat, and that could allow adversaries to discover our documents on the internet, potentially reshare them, and once they're gone, right? We also find out that in the user's ability to upload files, which of course they need, there's no scanning. So could be a malicious insider. It could be maybe somebody who didn't realize that they had a file that was malicious. They upload it, and now we've propagated malware through the system. Other people are downloading it, and it's spreading across our enterprise environment. So there's no file integrity checks. Malicious files can be uploaded to the system. Something interesting is a lot of enterprises may say, maybe even universities would say, we only need access from a certain region. Maybe it's even just the United States. So why even allow access from other countries? That maybe that shouldn't be turned on. That can reduce our risk. And because for this particular use case, we have that integration back to our on-prem environment, we're worried about lateral movement. Because of that weak authentication, because of that lack of encryption, if something were to be compromised, now the blast radius, as we say, is greater, right? It's not just to the SaaS environment, but it's also to all the things that talk to it, which in my example here was our HR system. So lateral movement is a big deal for us. We talked about the plugins and the add-ons. Of course, there could be software vulnerabilities in those add-ons. We don't know what the vendor's doing to vet those developers and getting their add-ons into that app store. Are they scanning the code? What if a malicious, I don't want to say a malicious vendor, but someone who's not really a vendor gets into the app store because they're trying to propagate malware? So again, something that we need to worry about. And finally, the over-permissioned API itself, right? Is that something that we actually want enabled on the public internet? So long list of threats here, lots of things to worry about, in this use case. What are we going to do? So the next step is really to think about back to those three principles from the shared responsibility model, right? The user access, the data access, and the configuration. What is actually available to us to fix these things? So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So first, we're going to start with the user access controls. What is actually available to us in the SaaS platform? It's important as security professionals that we understand that. And so what we find out is that this particular platform has something called conditional access, where we can go in and either give it a range of IP addresses to say, only allow users to access from this range, right? So it's my trusted IP ranges, or only allow users to connect from these geographic regions. So we won't mention certain countries, but maybe there's certain countries that we would say we never want them to access from there. So all that is sort of part of conditional access. We also find out that the vendor themselves, the SaaS platform, can enforce multi-factor authentication and not let someone log in unless they have MFA enabled. So that could help us in that third-party use case. We could, of course, require all users to use our enterprise IDP or enterprise single sign-on. That might be a user concern, which we'll talk about later, where they, having to create accounts for third parties might be a little bit of a hurdle for users. We can enable things like lifecycle management, right? So when users are onboarded and offboarded, we want to ensure that their accounts are being disabled. Back to strong authentication, no basic auth, strong password policies, password expiration. A lot of the SaaS platforms can enforce those policies for us. And finally, we can turn off guest access and anonymous access. If you're using a SaaS platform and it doesn't have that ability, that's certainly a concern. Moving on to data controls. From here, we can look at what can we actually do with the data once it's in the SaaS vendor's hands, once it's there in what we call our tenant in the SaaS vendor's environment. And sometimes you'll actually be able to encrypt your data at rest, in addition to whatever they may be doing on their physical devices, right? The vendor's physical hardware, or hopefully they're encrypting it. Not that really I don't think it's that much of a risk that someone can walk into the data center and pull a hard drive, but they do encrypt for that scenario. So an example here might be if you've ever used something like Proton Mail, the mail client, you can actually go in and set up a second password so that you log into your account with your password and MFA, and then your actual emails are encrypted. So you need another password to decrypt your emails. So this is a data control that some SaaS platforms have available to us. Some SaaS platforms will even say, I'll let you limit the file types that you can actually upload here. So maybe in this example, we only want to do PDFs, PowerPoint, Word, Excel, that kind of stuff. We can also configure data retention policies. So maybe we age out and expire old data. And that might help us if malware was uploaded and it was 60 days ago and now it's outside of the data retention policy, it's gone already. Another thing that's possible in more of these sophisticated SaaS environments is digital rights management. So even if I didn't have a lot of those other things turned on and someone did access my data and my documents, they may get it and it's going to look like garbage when they open it because it's actually encrypted, and it's encrypted with DRM. They don't have the rights to open the document. So when they open it, it's useless to them. If they get a license because they're an authorized user, then they would be able to view the content there. So DRM is becoming a more important thing in some of these environments. And then usually you can get really granular with your folder and file level permissions. So that's an important configuration. And something I want to point out here is that these things may seem like obvious, but out of the box, a lot of these SaaS environments are not configured with these things enabled. As an example, a very popular productivity suite allows you to turn on mail out of the box that I can access it from anywhere, single factor through a web browser. So I could basically just go to the Apple Store, log in, and forget to shut the window, and anybody can then get to my mail. So those are things that we want to make sure that we're looking at and are enabling. And then finally, moving on to the SaaS configuration itself, what other features and functionality we can turn on. Usually there are things where you can turn off legacy protocols. So using the mail example again, we can turn off old things like POP and IMAP. We can turn off basic auth. We can disable API access, or we can say only users who've been granted access to that API, only a small set of users can actually access the API. So it's an explicit permission list. We could turn off plugins. I know this is something that Office 365 has. Some users may be frustrated by that, but if they try to go to the App Store and install a plugin, it just won't work. It tells them they need an administrator install it for them. So we can get some vetting, getting a vetting process in place there. Some of those default turned on things, we can make sure that those are all turned off. We can go in and verify those features are enabled and turn them off. We can even configure the token and session lifetimes, right? So my Apple Store example where I had my mail there, if the out of the box default is that my session never expires, and you probably see something like that with Gmail, right? It's always, you don't have to log in again, usually. We can configure those things and make it so that maybe it times out in 10 hours or 24 hours, maybe like a typical workday. And finally, there's in some of these newer, more complex SaaS environments, the vendors are offering their own application protection, application management. They will provide logs in the system, so you can pull event logs, you can pull authentication logs. They'll even allow you to say, we can do maybe like a host integrity check, or we can check that a certificate is actually on the device to allow access to it. So it's getting into more of a device trust mode. So more sophisticated, and it usually costs more, but those are things that are available too. Okay, so recapping where we're at right now. So we took all of the use cases, we figured out our threats, we used our framework, and now we have the knowledge of what's actually available from the SaaS vendor. What are our configuration options? So now what? Now we take all of that and we do the analysis on our threats to figure out how can we actually make realistic mitigations, realistic compensating controls that us or our IT administrators can apply to the SaaS environment to get rid of those threats. And that's where the risks come in. It's turning those threats into risks that we basically can roll up. And so again, in the interest of time, jumped ahead and done that, so that nearly dozen list of threats have really rolled up to six risks. And I worded these in a way that you would communicate to maybe a non-technical user. maybe a business user, right? So in thinking back to the example of Slack and someone saying, why am I suddenly having to implement or input a PIN on my phone just to access a chat application? Well, we can show them these risks. We can say, this is why, right? These are the things that we're worried about. So the first thing is that someone can intercept our data. They can intercept the data and there could be data leakage. So we know that you're uploading very sensitive data to the environment. We have to solve for that. So how are we going to do that? We're going to ensure that it's end-to-end encryption. We're going to disable any features in the SaaS platform that allow for unencrypted traffic. On the account compromise front, we're going to implement things like privileged access management. So for users who are like administrators or privileged access, they're going to be restricted in what they can do, or they may have to do something like a just-in-time admin access, where they have to check out their administrative capabilities to access the environment. These are real things that we can implement for that use case. We're going to implement that user account management, the lifecycle management that we talked about. We're going to enforce MFA, password policies, the IP restrictions, the conditional access. And we may not be able to enforce it, especially since we have everything else, but we can recommend that those third-party users only use our enterprise single sign-on. So they're using our IDP, which we control. On the API front, use and abuse of the APIs as another entry vector for data leakage or unauthorized access. We're going to disable any legacy protocols. We're going to disable the legacy authentication. We're going to enforce key rotation. An actual key to access the API has to be rotated maybe every 30 days or maybe every 6 months, depending on our risk tolerance level there. So if a key did get compromised, we can rotate it out and that authentication goes away. We're also going to reduce the amount of users that can access the API and the functions that they can call. Maybe they don't need read, write, and delete to the API. Maybe they only need to read the data. We don't want them modifying the data. So we're gonna implement that too. On the system misconfiguration side, right, the anonymous access, the guest access that we talked about, we're basically gonna disable those. We're gonna disable the guest, anonymous, and expiring URLs. And if there's any kind of application isolation or sandboxing that the SaaS provider provides, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, we'll want to turn that on too, along with DRM. And then on the threat of malware, the risks of malware being uploaded to the system, we're going to turn on file integrity checks, enforce that it's actually checking the metadata, that it's, does it say it's a JPEG, but it's actually executable. We're going to implement some vulnerability scanning and scanning of the files themselves. We can actually plug in malware scanners to the files and disable those plugins so that administrators have to approve it before an add-on is added to the environment to reduce risk. And finally, thinking back to the SaaS environment, being able to talk back to our on-prem environment, we need to think about network segmentation. We need to think about vulnerability scanning of our environment. We want to make sure that any holes are plugged in our environment so that as that data is traversing or that connectivity is happening back to our other systems, that all of that is either separated off or scanned for any other vulnerabilities. So hopefully the takeaway so far is that there's a lot to do in that shared responsibility model, right? It looked small. It looked like we just had user access, data access, and configuration to worry about, but we've come up with so many mitigations that actually need to be implemented in just one SaaS provider, just one vendor that we're using. But that's not it. That's not all. There's more. And I touched on it earlier. I mentioned monitoring and incident response. It's critical, right? I don't want to skip that, but part of that is seeing what the vendor actually has available to us. If we're using our enterprise single sign-on, if we're using our enterprise IDP, we can capture authentication logs. So we can look for anomalous activity, right? We can look to see, did Aaron log in from Pennsylvania and then an hour later logged in from China? That doesn't look right. We can see what other events the vendors have and pull those logs in to do our monitoring and incident response. And we should be asking the vendor themselves, what do you do when you detect an incident? how quickly do you notify us, and how quickly are you going to engage us? So it's not even just about the mitigations, right? It's about the proactive monitoring of the environment and having a strong incident response playbook. But there is more that we can actually ask of the vendor too, right? So we can vet the vendor. We can do a vendor security review. We can ask for certifications. We can ask them for pen test reports. They're not always going to share this data with us. And we're certainly not going to ask Microsoft of that, but a smaller, I'll say like mom and pop or startup SaaS vendor, they're probably eager to get our licenses and get on contract. So they will share their SOC 2 compliance. They will share maybe a third-party assessment that was done. And that helps us to understand that, okay, they've got a good cybersecurity process in place too. So we know they're doing what they need to do as part of the shared responsibility model. I had mentioned earlier, creating hurdles for the user, right? We do want to be cognizant of that. If we implement too many controls or controls that users can just circumvent, we haven't done our job, right? If they can get around our controls or they go use another platform. So my example of Slack, if they're like, well, now you've put all these controls around Slack, I don't want to use it anymore. I'm just going to go use Discord. We have no visibility, no control. We didn't implement anything on Discord. So now we've made things actually worse. So we got to make sure that we partner with the business, and that, sort of shifting over to a different platform or not telling us about another platform, we call that shadow IT, right? So we have to be aware of that. But what can we do about things like shadow IT? And are there tools that are out there that can help us, aside from all the mitigations and monitoring and controls that we can do? Yes, these tools exist. I'm definitely not going to plug any tools here. I think my personal opinion is that our money is better spent on people and process, less on tools, but there are tools that can help. So when talking about something like shadow IT, something called a CASB, a Cloud Security Access Broker, is something that can potentially help, though it may cause noise. There's two types of CASBs. One is a forward proxy that actually you filter all your data back through the CASB, and it can monitor that traffic. So we can see, hey, you sent 5 terabytes of data last month to Dropbox, but OneDrive is actually your system of choice. So what's going on? There's a lot of shadow IT there. There's other CASBs that don't filter the traffic through. They actually query the APIs of the SaaS environments to tell you what's going on there. Of course, there's data loss prevention systems, so we can monitor where documents are going or if they're leaving our environment. There's mobile data management and mobile application management, where we can actually manage the devices, and we can say, we're not going to allow you to access the SaaS environment unless you have this tool on there that monitors the device and manages the device and protects it. And sometimes that can even create a secure container. Like Microsoft actually has this for Office 365, where it can keep all of your Office documents in the Office 365 apps on your phone. So it reduces the risk of data leakage because it can't leave that secure container. And the last tool here is something new that a lot of vendors are jumping all over now or saying that they have a solution for. It's called SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. And it's flipping that model of sending all that traffic through like a CASB or even back to your on-prem firewalls. And they're basically targeting the services at the connection source to do some security control there. So really, that's everything I wanted to cover. Just talk about the takeaways, and then we'll open up to Q&A with the time we have left. But hopefully the takeaway you got here is that the shared responsibility model doesn't tell the whole story, right? We went through over 24 mitigations that we need to implement in our world, in those 3 categories for the shared responsibility model. But threat modeling is a really powerful tool for determining the risk to these platforms, and really to any system that we have control over. We need to consider what options are available in those SaaS platforms. So we need to look at the platform holistically and see what's available and partner with our users and with IT admins. And then finally, tooling, it's not the be all end all. It can help, but really the most important thing from that perspective is spending time on incident response and proactive monitoring. So with that, happy to open it up to questions. I will make one more plug. I plugged the Mitre Attack Framework. I'll plug my company's job page. NBC Universal, or NBC Uni, or NBC UNI, careers.com. We've got a ton of cybersecurity jobs out there. So please, if you're interested, hit up our URL and just search for cyber, and you'll find our jobs. So any questions? I see a question asking for access to the presentation. Yeah, I mean, if you want to email me, I can mail the presentation. I think my graphics are a little big, so it might come in at around like 12 megs. But otherwise, if I could always send it to the administrators here if they want to share it. But I have no problem sharing the presentation.
Looks like we have one in the chat.
Oh, I see that now.
Yeah, go ahead and.
Sure. How good are you finding the various providers of publishing best practices for securing their SaaS deployments? It's all over the place, to be totally honest. If you are deploying something like Office 365, tons of documentation, maybe a little overwhelming. They do a really great job at that. And some of the bigger vendors, for sure. Smaller companies, it's hard to even get their best practices for what they're doing to protect the environment, let alone how you should be implementing security. So it is kind of all over the map currently, I'd say. I see a hand raised too, I think.
Yeah, it looks like Giovanni. Giovanni, I turned on your microphone if you would like to speak.
I see another question while we're waiting. What actions does a platform take when in the midst of or after a cyber attack? So if we're asking about the vendor themselves, typically we want the vendor to tell us as quickly as possible. When we have a strong incident response team and we have a strong playbook, we want to get in the loop immediately, right? We want to do the investigations on our side too. So we want them to pull us in. But oftentimes they're going to do their triage first because they're worried about upsetting the customers, right? So they're going to say, is this real? They're going to do some active investigations and then sometimes notify us maybe a little bit too late of the breach. So that varies a lot too. But yeah, we want them to notify us as soon as possible. See another question in there. How does having multiple levels of security within an organization complicate models? That's a great question. It definitely complicates things. So if you have a very large organization that has separate business units and maybe they have their own security teams, how do you get that enterprise perspective? What if one business unit is using Slack for this purpose and another one's using Discord and another one's using Microsoft Teams? How do we apply the same logic to all of them? It's difficult. It's extremely difficult. I think in organizations where you have a overarching cybersecurity team that covers all of the business units, that makes it better. Now, you still need folks embedded in the business to understand their use cases and work directly with them, but it's better to have that overarching enterprise view, I think. But yeah, multiple levels, multiple different teams of security can complicate things. Another, how do you handle employees using tools such as Box, et cetera? How do you track where your data is going? It's a problem. It's definitely a problem. I think that tools help a bit there today in that, like things like DLP, if we can use DLP to say, hey, this is going to Box or Dropbox, but Microsoft OneDrive is our actual solution of choice, the best that can do really is probably alert us. Sometimes it can block stuff, but a lot of times that becomes noise. And so, typically enterprises will have it just in alert mode. And then, you'll see someone mailing something or putting something in Box and they say, it actually wasn't company data. I was using my company computer to do my home finance spreadsheet. So that becomes really difficult. Where I think the future is going is digital rights management or information rights management, because then it almost doesn't matter let them put it in Box, let them put it in Dropbox, let them put it in OneDrive. If no one can actually do anything with the data because they're not authenticated, they're not authorized to see it, that helps us tremendously. So I don't think it's as mature as we want it to be yet. I think there's a lot of strong capabilities there for PDFs, Word and Office documents, but maybe not so much for video and other different data types. See another one in the chat here. Any lines in the sand where you simply won't do business with a SaaS provider despite push from the business unit? We try. We absolutely try. I would say that most security professionals will say, I have to lay out the risks, right? And that's my job, is to say, this is how serious this is. This is how big of an impact it's going to be, right? Like, this risk might be so serious that we're going to be in the news, we're going to impact customer data. And then the best that we can do really is escalate that to the highest levels that we can. But sometimes at some point, there might be an executive at a really high level that's going to say, I'm willing to accept that risk. I'm letting cybersecurity or the security team go, and it's not your responsibility. I'm just going to accept that risk. We hate when that happens because we feel like we didn't fix anything. So we try to draw the line in the sand, but it's not always possible. Okay, any more? Definitely happy to answer more questions through email if folks think of any later.
Yeah, great. I think that was good. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think, this presentation will be available on our website and on YouTube in a couple of days here. So Aaron, thanks again for being with us. We just really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.